The last time I preached a sermon here was in 2012, almost 10 years ago. Now we'll see who's got a good memory and who hasn't. For those who were here, Lou might have been here, Dell and Graham might have been here, Gary and Norma, but not too many. Now the last time I preached this sermon was up at Atherton, and I got very sick up there. And I've been very sick the last couple of days, so I took a double dose of tablets this morning, so if I start talking funny, you'll understand why. It was just to get me up here. Okay. A topic that's always fascinated me was that verse, "Let us make man in our image." In the ancient world, well before the Egyptians, Babylonians, the Assyrians, the people worshipped many different gods. It's called polytheism, where they worship different gods. They had a god of the air, god of the ocean, a god of the forest, a god of the land. They had thousands of gods, different gods for everything. They lived with the stories and legends of these gods in the ancient civilizations, and they were passed down through time. And there were stories of the gods warring in heaven. And there were stories of gods crossing the line with humans and half human, half godlike beings coming into existence. These half gods were said to be the rulers and kings of the people. It set the ruling class as an elite group of demigods over the people. They were worshipped, they couldn't be judged, and people were sacrificed to them. And the ruling class and their descendants and families deified themselves. They proclaimed that they were gods. We read about the start of this in Genesis. Noah's descendants after the flood had started. And mankind was worth nothing except as slaves to the ruling class. But the Israelites believed in only one God, a God who said, "Let us make man in our image." This concept of mankind being made in God's image changed everything. It turned everything upside down for those ancient civilizations there. It divided the ancient world. And I still think it's dividing our world today, this concept that we're made in God's image. One of the main distinguishing characteristics of the descendants of Abraham was that mankind was worth something. Before that time, mankind wasn't worth much at all. How much we're worth depends so much on how you view this understanding. We go right back to the beginning of all time. We're told in the Bible in Ezekiel 28:17, Lucifer became proud of his own image and what he was worth. In Ezekiel 28:17 it says, "Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendour." Lucifer thought he was equal to God. A few years ago, I used to work in an environment where there's a lot of confusion about identity, about what you were worth. And many people would get lost in this world. I remember a young fella walking into the office one day. I was covering the front desk for the girls who were having lunch. He was 6'2", 6'3", good-looking young guy, about 30. Could have had anything he wanted. And he told me he wanted to kill himself. I thought, this guy looked the goods, he could have anything, but yet here he was so traumatised. So I got him the help that he needed. Everyone's searching, everyone wants to know what they're worth. They want to know their identity in this world. Some are obsessed with their image. Some people embark on health routines, trying to improve their image through their health. They work in the gym for hours. Some people take steroids to try and build up that physique, that Adonis-like physique. Politicians and movie celebrities have image consultants. They employ people to create an image for them that they can present in a movie or they can present in the world. These people end up being worshipped above what they're really worth because of the image they present to us. Marketing and television has skewed our perceptions of image and what we should wear, how we should look, how we should act. How often do you see those fashion shows where they start wearing those ridiculous clothes that couldn't possibly be comfortable? And they're certainly not functional. But it's all about image. It's all about presentation. Image can give you a confidence that you wouldn't otherwise have, a confidence to go out and do something. We judge people on their jobs. We judge people by the cars they drive. We judge them by where they live, the houses they have. Does it seem fair that we judge people according to these values? It's happening every day. And Jesus got good reason to remind us not to judge people. We can get it so very wrong when we do that. Our society has become so obsessed with image that we associate beauty with goodness and ugly with bad. But some of the most beautiful animals and insects can also be the most deadly. And it's the same with people too. We have to be wary of that. So if we look good, then are we really good? If we look bad, are we really bad? It doesn't seem fair. Good-looking people get the good jobs. And you know, statistics support that evidence, that people who look good do get the jobs over people who maybe don't look as good. Is that fair? A lot of it comes down to presentation. Unfortunately, if you're not a classic oil painting, you're not going to get the benefits of life that some other people do. Has our image, the way we're born, the way we look, an influence on our lives? Does that affect our futures? I was working in Sydney many years ago as a police officer down there, and one of my colleagues said to me, "Have you noticed how ugly and hard some of these criminals look?" And I hadn't really noticed it. I never thought about it, gave it much thought until he mentioned it. And then in reflecting, I could see the connection. A lot of the people that were arrested and in the cells had a very hard demeanour, a very harsh look about them there. Now, this is a known issue. Scientific studies can now clearly support this relationship, and in the British Journal of Plastic Surgery, studies show that 60% of people in the prison population have more pronounced facial deformities than the general population, which is only about 20%. They call it the Quasimodo effect. It's rather unique. So here's the question we need to think about. Was it the crime and their difficult life that caused them to look rough and sinister? Or was there physical features? Did that have an effect on leading them into the crime because of the way they were treated? How do we see that? Mrs. White raises this issue. She says in her writings that sin hardens the heart, and it's reflected on the exterior. Contrary, that a life with Jesus softens the countenance there. And without doubt, we react to the world around us, and many people act as mirrors to the way we present. They reflect goodness if we respond warmly or poorly. I could tell you countless stories about how I've been treated depending on the way I've acted. But I won't go into that. Look at a story that was brought to my attention. During the Second World War, England looked as though it was about to be overrun by the Germans. Wave after wave of enemy bombers destroyed all the infrastructure. It destroyed the morale in London. Every night there were nearly 1,500 German bombers came over to bomb London there. But it was only because of a handful of brave young men that the Royal Air Force was able to save London, or what was left of it there. Churchill's famous speech, The Few, in 1940 summed this up. He said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." These fighter pilots became the heroes and flew in the legendary Spitfires and Hurricanes, shooting down scores of the enemy bombers at the time. They were literally worshipped and idolised. They were the saviours of London and Britain. But it came at a great personal cost and a sacrifice to many of these young men. People at the time would rush up just to touch these pilots. The young kids considered them heroes. And they all wanted to be pilots, fighter pilots for Britain. But many of these pilots were shot down by the Germans, and only a few survived. One of the design flaws in the Hurricanes and Spitfires was that the fuel lines ran through the cockpits. And when the planes were hit, they'd erupt into a ball of flames, instantly burning the pilots. Those that lived wore the scars of victory with shocking burns to much of their bodies. And because their heads were relatively unprotected, the flames would literally melt the skin off their faces, and they suffered horrific injuries at the time. If you've ever seen any of the photos, you'll notice how dreadful they were. Now, there was a young man called Peter Foster. He was one of those pilots. These heroes and Peter were sent to a specialised hospital where plastic surgery was in its infancy. There was a doctor called Sir Archibald Macindoe. He probably wasn't a Sir at the time. He became Sir Archibald Macindoe later on because of the work they did. And they affectionately called it the Guinea Pig Club. Here, the doctor performed amazing attempts at skin grafts to restore them with some measure of dignity. And this new medical technology used a two-stage process for grafting. They would graft the pilot's arms onto their stomach there until the skin established blood flow. They'd walk around like that for months. Then they would separate the skin from the stomach and graft the forearms up onto the pilot's faces. And they'd walk around like that for months until it established blood flow, and then they'd try and graft the skin into their faces to restore their faces. In this environment, in the hospital, they're surrounded by their comrades and dedicated medical teams. And despite their pain and appearance, they encouraged one another. They were happy there, they were safe, they were accepted in that environment. They weren't judged by their outward appearance, they were still heroes in that environment. But when it came time to leave the hospital, many were too scared to leave the hospital. They didn't want to face the world. Their greatest fear was how would they be received on the outside world. They were still fighter pilots on the inside, but on the outside they were deformed. They didn't look like they once did. And sadly, there's horrific stories of some of these young men not being accepted back into the world because of the way they looked. Once they were heroes, but now they were rejected by the world. Some of the wives couldn't bear to look at their husbands, and they left the young pilots all alone. People soon forgot that these young men were the heroes that had saved London and Britain from the Germans. They'd given their lives and health to save the country, and walking down the street, it wasn't uncommon for them to be laughed at and ridiculed for their appearance. They had difficulty finding work, And many ended their lives as alcoholics, ended their life as lonely, in despair, and some even committed suicide. Peter Foster was severely scarred. And the big question was his wife going to accept him? Was now. He was laughed at by the world, but Peter's wife did accept him the way he looked. And Peter said when he became discouraged, he knew he could turn to his wife and he could see the love. He could still see acceptance in her eyes, that she accepted him the way he was now. And here's a clear example of how we react to acceptance in the world. And as Christians, we can see how important it is that we reflect and react appropriately to people. We know our appearance can sometimes be bad, but we know that God still accepts us, regardless of our outside appearance. We were originally created in God's image, and as Anne said earlier, sometimes that image becomes distorted. The wind gets on the water and chops the water up. Sometimes you can't see that original image there. And the Bible tells us man was honoured by God, being made in the image of God. We'll have a look at this now. Then God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness. Those words have divided history on what you're worth. So that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals and over all the creatures that move on the ground. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created them, male and female, he created them. Dr. Paul Brand was a leprosy doctor. He India for most of his life with the leprosy patients, and he tried to restore some dignity to them after they'd been scarred by leprosy. He points out that Adam was created the fastest like a horse, or as pretty as a bird, or as strong as an elephant. Our eyes aren't as good as an eagle. We can't smell as good as a dog. In fact, many animals have higher developed senses than man, but man was unique amongst all creation. He received something far better than what the animals received. When God created man in his image, God breathed into Adam his own life, and man became a living soul. Adam and Eve were made so they could have communion with God. A communion which the animals couldn't have. This communion was free will and the ability to love God. And Adam and Eve were given dominion over the earth and all that it contained, to plunder it. But they had the privilege of being God's representatives here. Can we still see this image of God in mankind today? Is it possible? Mankind and nature possess some wonderful qualities that inspire and amaze us. But we know that creation now only dimly represents the beauty that it once was. When I consider the amount of coal that's under the ground, and gas and oil, knowing that that came from vegetation, we can't even begin to imagine what the world was like once with that there. It's only a poor reflection of what the world once was like. When Michelangelo created the masterpiece in the Sistine Chapel there, he depicted God as they saw God at the time, reaching out his hand towards Adam to instill life. That's how they imagined God in their mind. God had similar features to us, according to them. Arms, legs. He looked like a human there. And Thomas Aquinas considered all this, and he determined that the world mirrors God as its creator. Just as an artist can sign a painting to identify his handiwork, God has written his own signature in the world, in us, in nature. And if we look too long at the painting, we become enamoured with the painting. We lose sight of the creator. We lose sight of the painter, the person who painted it. We should be looking at the painter, not the painting itself. And this is where sometimes we get caught up. So we need to look more towards God, and there's several ways we can see the image of God. We need to be careful not to trust in modern thinking. The original words of God in Genesis state, "Let us make man in our image." But modern philosophy and modern man says, "Let's make God in our image." That's what they're attempting to do now. The new cancel culture and politically correct want to change the wording of the Bible to suit what they interpret it as. I was interested to read an article about scientists and psychologists that create an artificial intelligence God. You've heard about AI, artificial intelligence in computers. They believe they can create a God like that on a computer, which can start to dominate and people will eventually bow down and worship to. This is where the world is heading, what people are considering doing. Our culture tells us that we have to know ourselves first before we can understand God, before we can understand others. But this seems to be still man's attempt to create God in man's image. C.S. Lewis summed it up and he says, "The ancient man approached God as the accused person approaches a judge. The modern man now has changed roles. Modern man has now become the judge of God, and we want to judge God according to the way we see things. Modern endeavours to understand what God is like by looking within ourselves can only lead to a picture no greater than us. We can't imagine an immeasurable God if we start looking within ourselves. There's a classic example on how most Christians have been reflected, and they've been reflected poorly. Gandhi in India was fascinated with Jesus. But when he met Christians, he was let down. He was disappointed by Christians. Christians are supposed to be the followers of Jesus Christ, but they didn't reflect that. He said, if Christians lived according to their faith, there would be no more Hindus left in India. What a powerful statement. And Mother Teresa said, often we Christians constitute the worst obstacles for those that try to become closer to Christ. We often preach a gospel we don't live. And this is the principal reason why people of the world don't believe. She said, if people saw the image that was preached, then millions of lives could be saved and brought to Jesus. And when we look to science to explain man, we see incredible complexity. But the more complexity we see, the more questions it raises and the more we can't see anything but a creator. In light of this, we need to approach God humbly. We need to understand what image we're looking at. In the Bible, Jesus tells us that God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. Is it any wonder God said, "You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below"? Whatever we can create, whatever we can imagine, whatever idols we could make, any images could never compare, could never reflect what God wants us to see. Moses was one who sought to see the Lord. And Moses said to God, "Show me your glory." God could have declared to Moses his glory in any number of ways, but how did God declare his glory to Moses? When Moses asked, "Show me your glory," he came down in a cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. God could have shown himself to Moses in any number of ways, but this is how God chose to show himself to Moses. God would rather have us know him for these qualities than any of his other qualities. Here we see a parallel with Jesus. When Jesus came to reveal God to men, this isn't what mankind expected or wanted. They wanted something different. And Jesus highlights that man consists of more than outward appearance. There's no physical qualities that would specifically have attracted us to Jesus. We're told in Isaiah, he grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. Here again, God doesn't want us to worship the outside qualities. Doesn't want us to know him for that reason. There was a young girl called Agnes. Agnes saw the image of God within mankind. And she reflected the image of God through her work. She imparted hope through her ministry. She later became known as Mother Teresa. When asked why she spent all her time in the dirty, smelly suburbs of Calcutta, her reply was that every person needed to see Jesus. Every person needed to know they were not alone. And even at the point of death, they also needed to be shown some dignity and love in their suffering. It's interesting that Mother Teresa said that it was not their hunger or leprosy, but it was loneliness that brought these people the greatest anguish in their time of need. She said just sitting with them until they died brought them the greatest peace. This is how she reflected the image. And she saw the image of God in each and every one of those people. She said that she saw Jesus in every poor, lost and suffering soul. In ministering to them and in touching them, she was ministering to and touching the very person of Jesus himself. What a wonderful image of compassion. Isn't this the way God wants us to see people? The same way she saw people. When we move to Jesus, to look at how he reflected the image of God, we come across the word Jesus was moved. Jesus was moved with compassion. He was moved to become a servant to the people. He was moved to restore their health. He was moved to give them health. Jesus didn't do nothing. He was moved by his emotions towards people. In Hebrews, we're being told, Jesus, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, Jesus fully reflected God. And if you had known me, he said, you know my Father also. And from henceforth you know him and have seen him. And yet there's a clearer presentation of God the Father that we'll see. A clearer presentation of Jesus and what we're worth. When we read in Matthew wrote, then he, Pilate, released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Then the governor's soldiers took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole company of soldiers around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it in his hands, or set it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand as a scepter. Then they knelt in front of him and mocked him. Hail, King of the Jews, they said. They spat on him and took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. The image they saw in Jesus at that time rebuked their sins. They saw the opposite of their pride at that time. And they were terrified when they realised their selfishness and their pride. And they sought to deface the King of life at that time. His flesh was torn open by the whips. Blood flowed from his wounds. But it was not enough to beat him. It was Satan's purpose to drive him to retaliation. He was cursed and that crown hammered into his forehead. They beat him again and again. And in borrowing from the book The Desire of Ages, we read, as their cruelty degraded his torturers below humanity to the likeness of Satan, so did his meekness and patience exalt Jesus above humanity and prove his kinship to God. Pilate presented Jesus bloodied and beaten, and he said, behold the man. Never in world history had the contrast been so clear between the image of Satan and the image of God at that time. Through his agony and torture, we're told, not the least murmur had been forced from his lips. And from the Desire of Ages again we read, there stood the Son of God, wearing the robe of mockery and the crown of thorns, stripped to the waist. His back showed the long cruel stripes from which the blood flowed freely. His face was stained with blood and bore the marks of exhaustion and pain. But never had it appeared more beautiful than now. What a remarkable statement, that last sentence. At such a time, never had his face appeared more beautiful than at that moment. She says, the Saviour's visage was not marred before his enemies. Every feature expressed gentleness and resignation and tenderest pity for his cruel foes. In his manner there was no cowardly weakness, but the strength and dignity of long suffering. This is the image of God that he wants us to see. This is the extent that God will go to for us. This is what God thinks you are worth. It's the image he wants. And when God says, let us make man in our image, it takes on a whole new significance that God would step down for us. So So how do we become changed into this image? Paul tells us, but we all with open face beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord are changed into the same image, from glory to glory, even as by the Spirit of the Lord. It's only by beholding the image of God that we can be changed into that image. And you say, Amen. Thank you.